What you're about to hear isn't just celebrity gossip. This is the total unraveling of what the internet once crowned as black love royalty. Behind the smiles, the red carpets, and the carefully curated image, something dark was quietly decaying. For years, Papoose was celebrated as the very definition of loyalty, the man who waited, the man who stood firm while his wife, Remy served 6 years behind bars, enduring birthdays, holidays, prison visits, sacrifice after sacrifice. The story seemed simple: real love can survive anything. But tonight, that story shatters. And it shatters in the most unsettling way imaginable. According to Papoose himself, this marriage didn't just crack. It broke, in moments he witnessed inside his own home, moments that allegedly unfolded while their daughter was right there. And here's where this stops being entertainment and becomes deeply uncomfortable. What happens when the person you defended becomes someone you no longer recognize? When loyalty turns into silence, and silence turns into betrayal? And what happens when the truth doesn't emerge gently, but explodes live on Instagram for the entire world to see? Once Papoose broke his silence, the fallout was immediate. Accusations, receipts, counterclaims. A boxer drawn into the middle of a private marriage. Divorce papers waved like evidence. Fans split into teams overnight, and a child found herself trapped at the center of adult chaos. This isn't about who tweeted first. It isn't about who looks better online. This is about what allegedly happened behind closed doors, and why the image of perfect black love may never fully recover. Stay here, because after this, nothing will ever look the same.
Every birthday we celebrate as a family. Okay. Matter of fact, I'm gonna go back further. When she was away, I visited her all the time. I visited her so much that I feel like I know a lot of the people she was locked up with. Because I sat on the visiting floor from 8 in the morning to 3:15 when the visit is over. So through that time, she would just tell me certain situations that was going on in the jail and all of that. Anybody from Bedford Hills, can you please step to the front?
At one time, this marriage seemed untouchable. In an industry where relationships flame out in months, Papoose and Remy were sold as something rare, a survival story, a symbol, a reminder that love could endure prison walls, fame, and the passage of time. While the world watched Remy vanish for 6 long years, the narrative remained clean, simple. He waited, she returned, they triumphed. But stories don't collapse all at once. They fracture slowly, quietly, in corners where cameras never reach. Long before accusations, before Instagram lives, before online factions took sides, there existed a version of this marriage built entirely on relentless sacrifice. And according to Papoose, this wasn't symbolic, it was lived every single day. He wasn't a distant husband holding down the fort from afar. He embedded himself in her world even while she was locked away. Prison visits weren't occasional, they were ritual. Long hours spent on hard floors, listening to tales of who was inside, who could be trusted, who truly mattered. Over time, names became familiar. Faces became imagined. Connections formed through repetition. That's how proximity works, not intimacy, proximity, and proximity creates blind spots. From the outside, the comeback appeared flawless. Holidays returned. Birthdays became family celebrations again. Social media flooded with images reassuring fans that nothing had changed, that the waiting had been worth it. But audiences rarely ask what people are pressured to perform once a story becomes profitable. When a couple becomes a brand, truth itself becomes expensive. Money enters not as wealth, but as narrative. According to Papoose,
visited her all the time, so she told me plenty of stories. So I know these people. She had a friend that she was away with. Right? Okay. Do I want to say this individual's name? Let me just move along with the story. She had a certain individual who she was locked up with. I always heard this person's name. I ain't think nothing of it. Cool. It's her friend. Okay, she's home now. We celebrate all holidays together. If you look down my page, I hate to say this, but it's one of the things that I want y'all to look at. Because when she said about me spending money, you'll see the gifts being bought. You'll see the diamond necklaces and chains being bought when she started the league. Since she wanted to fabricate and say, oh, he never wanted me to start the league. You see that. You'll see the Mother's Days. You'll see the Christmas. You'll see the birthdays. But you know what an ungrateful person says? They downplay that. They downplay that. So the most important part is not the materialistic things, what she seems to keep talking about. Y'all notice that? Every time she's talking about me, it's about materialism. and fabricating about money because she thinks that y'all think she's the bigger artist. So she's playing along with that. She thinks that y'all think she rich. This is the same individual who just texted me a screenshot and said, "This is how much money I got."
After hearing that segment, one thing becomes unmistakably clear. This isn't just about money. It's about narrative, about how a story is framed. Because once a relationship is reduced to transactions, history becomes easier to rewrite. Support transforms into control. Sacrifice becomes obligation. And the person who stayed steadfast suddenly becomes the one who supposedly held someone back. That kind of reframing doesn't happen in isolation. It begins when a third presence quietly re-enters the picture. According to Papoose, a name from the past resurfaced after Remy returned home, a person he had heard of before, a story from inside her world. On its own, nothing seemed alarming. Just someone from a shared history stepping into a shared present. At first, everything appeared normal. Then came a request that didn't fit the pattern. A birthday, once a family celebration, suddenly wasn't. An all-girls gathering replaced what had always been shared. Papoose stepped back. No argument, no confrontation, just space. And space is where patterns begin to emerge. The guest arrived. She stayed. Nights stretched longer than expected. Behaviors shifted, just enough to feel off, but never enough to accuse. This is the danger zone in relationships, when intuition speaks, but logic stays silent. Most people wait. They don't want to be the first to name what feels wrong. People wait for certainty. And in this case, certainty didn't arrive through rumors, texts, or whispered suspicions. It came through absence, distance at bedtime, separate rooms, repeated choices that slowly, almost imperceptibly, redrew the boundaries of intimacy. According to Papoose, attempts to reconnect didn't explode into conflict. They faded into avoidance. Moments that had once been effortless now felt negotiated. And when intimacy requires negotiation, something essential has already shifted. What makes this stage of the story truly unsettling isn't the allegation itself. It's the timeline, the quiet, almost invisible erosion of normalcy. How explanations replaced closeness. How a marriage could continue functioning in public, even as it quietly drifted apart behind closed doors. This is often how collapses begin. Not with shouting, not with cheating headlines, but with patterns no one wants to confront, no one wants to name. And it's here, just before everything becomes irreversible, that Papoose claims the emotional foundation finally gave way.
We always celebrate our birthdays together. Me, her, and the baby birthday, my birthday, our family. They all come around. It's like, that's how I was raised, so I'm real big on family. So this particular year, she says, I want to have an all-girls party. So I'm like, okay. So you don't want me and the baby to come? All right. No, just my friends, all girls. I'm like, damn, that's a little, I don't want to say strange, but I was like, okay, we usually do it as a family, but this is cool. You want to have it with all girls. So she has the all-girls party. I don't go. I falls back. The friend who's incarcerated comes to the crib. She attends the all-girls party, all the friends, cool. After that, we have like a little dinner in the basement or whatever at the crib. So this is the first time I seen homegirl outside of when they was in the penitentiary together. So I see her at the crib. Okay, she stayed for a couple days. She spent the night. Cool. A little activity was a little weird, but I didn't think nothing.
And that's where this chapter ends. Not with proof, not with confrontation, but with a lingering unease. Because the most dangerous phase of any scandal isn't the revelation itself. It's the moment just before exposure, when something feels off, yet no one dares to speak it aloud. In the next part, that silence doesn't hold. Patterns accelerate. Boundaries dissolve. And according to Papoose, what he claims to have witnessed next is what transformed suspicion into certainty, loyalty into betrayal. By the time distance became routine, denial had already done its work. What once seemed like temporary adjustments slowly hardened into a new normal. Nights no longer followed the rhythm of a married couple. Conversations shortened. Explanations repeated. And the house they once shared began to feel segmented, each room marked by invisible emotional borders. This wasn't a sudden rupture. It was quiet erosion, unfolding while everyone pretended nothing had changed. At this stage, nothing had been caught. No confrontations, no screenshots, no raised voices, just a growing awareness that intimacy was being managed instead of shared. Bedtime, once an afterthought, became a decision point. And decisions reveal priorities. Papoose says the pattern became undeniable. The same explanation, the same destination, the same separation. And each time he accepted it, not because it felt right, but because confronting it felt heavier than living with doubt. That's how trust slowly unravels, not through scandalous headlines, but through repetition without resolution. The house itself became a silent witness. Large, quiet, expensive, filled with proof of provision, but empty of closeness. Night after night, he slept alone, telling himself that space didn't automatically mean betrayal, that patience was still the higher road, until patience stopped shielding the truth.
This time when she comes to visit the crib, every night when it's time to go to bed, she's telling me, oh, I'm gonna go sleep in the guest room with such and such. I don't even want to say this individual name, because I ain't even trying to give her no clout. She's a extreme clout chaser. So I don't even want to say her name. So she tells me, I'm going to sleep in the guest room with such and such. I said, okay, that's cool. I sleep in the room by myself.
That moment matters not for what it proved, but for what it quietly normalized. Once sleeping apart becomes acceptable, every other boundary begins to follow. Emotional walls soften, physical barriers vanish, and the marriage slowly drifts out of the center of its own home. According to Papoose, he still tried to bridge that distance. His attempts at closeness weren't demanding, weren't aggressive. They were human, simple efforts to reconnect. But when affection becomes conditional, it leaves behind a residue, a subtle sense that you're negotiating for something that used to be freely given. This is usually when suspicion flares. Yet, he says it didn't, at least, not yet. Suspicion requires a leap, and he wasn't ready to jump. He chose explanation over instinct, calm over conflict. Like many who have weathered long relationships, he assumed that if something was truly wrong, it would eventually announce itself. But it didn't. Instead, clarity arrived quietly, in subtle dissonance, small inconsistencies that couldn't be dismissed as stress or adjustment, the tone of voice that shifted, the timing of movements that felt off, the way answers no longer closed conversations but redirected them. And then there was the child. Not a witness yet, but a presence that changed the stakes entirely. When children exist within adult conflict, tolerance for ambiguity vanishes. What might once have been overlooked for the sake of peace suddenly demands accountability. According to Papoose, the day everything shifted began like any other. Business handled outside the home, routines unchanged. But inside, the house itself began to whisper that nothing would ever be the same. Routine movements, nothing out of the ordinary, no expectation of discovery. And yet, when he returned, the very layout of the house forced a realization he could no longer ignore. A long walkway, clear sight lines, familiar spaces suddenly feeling unfamiliar. And then, the absence that screamed. His daughter was alone, in a space she would never normally occupy by herself. That single detail mattered more than any allegation. Even without context, without interpretation, a child left unattended amid adult secrecy is a rupture all on its own. He moved through the house, confusion hardening into concern. Each step revealed more imbalance, one room occupied, another conspicuously empty, traces of recent activity with no explanation, and silence where reassurance should have lived. According to Papoose, his questions at that point weren't accusatory, they were urgent. Where is everyone? Why is she alone? What just happened here? But urgency didn't bring clarity. Instead, it met evasion, a quiet resistance that only deepened the unease.
So I go handle business. I come back in the crib. It's a big ass crib, and they got like a long walkway to get to our bedroom. It's like a long walkway, and then on the other side is the other rooms. So I come in the crib. As soon as I walk in, I look down towards our bedroom. I see my daughter in our room by herself. I say, yo, what the heck? Where the hell is she at? So I go up the other side.
That moment is where interpretation becomes unavoidable. According to Papoose, the physical reality of that scene didn't match the explanations that followed. The missing presence, the lack of accountability, the unanswered questions, and most significantly, the fact that a child had been left outside the bounds of adult responsibility. He says he asked questions, not hostile, not performative, just basic questions deserving honest, direct answers. But what came next, according to him, was deflection, vague responses, emotional redirection, excuses that failed to explain the sequence of events. And when explanations no longer align with reality, trust doesn't merely crack, it recalibrates. From that point on, everything looked different. Past behaviors were reinterpreted. Previous patterns gained new meaning. Nights apart, guarded affection, the insistence on privacy, all of it now existed under a new, unsettling lens. This is the dangerous stage of realization, the moment when the mind begins connecting dots it once refused to acknowledge. And still, even then, Papoose did not go public. He didn't broadcast suspicions. He didn't rally allies. He didn't threaten exposure. At that stage, he still held on to the hope that resolution could come through conversation, that truth could be restored privately, that whatever had shifted could be addressed without destroying everything. But relationships don't collapse because someone discovers the truth. They collapse when the truth is known and the other person refuses to acknowledge it. According to Papoose, the atmosphere in the home changed after that day, not louder, not colder, not outwardly confrontational, but defensive. The emotional tone shifted from confusion to resentment. And resentment is telling. It doesn't appear when someone is innocent. It appears when someone knows the ground beneath them has moved. By this point, silence was no longer neutral. It had become strategic. And when silence becomes strategy, the next phase is inevitable. Because eventually, silence stops shielding anyone. It only delays exposure. This part doesn't end with proof laid bare, or accusations shouted, but with the moment doubt solidifies into certainty. The moment patience runs out. The moment a private realization demands a public reckoning. By the time certainty arrived, silence had ceased to be protection. It had become positioning. According to Papoose, once the doubts stopped being abstract, the emotional temperature in the house shifted, not into chaos, but into resistance. Conversations became guarded. Explanations turned selective. And the more clarity he sought, the greater the friction that met him in response. This is the stage where most relationships never recover. Not because betrayal has been proven, but because the truth has been recognized and quietly rejected. What followed, according to Papoose, wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a slow, crushing realization that the relationship had entered a phase where even acknowledgement itself was dangerous. Where naming the problem felt more threatening than simply living with it. And that's when resentment began to surface. Not outwardly, not loudly, but in subtle behaviors. The emotional tone hardened. Patience was read as weakness. Questions that should have sparked accountability were reframed as accusations, and moments that should have led to resolution instead produced defensiveness. This is where gaslighting often begins, not as a conscious tactic, but as instinct. When someone senses that their version of events is slipping from control, the instinct isn't to explain, it's to undermine perception. He says that's when denial crossed the line. Not merely rejecting claims, but rejecting reality itself. What he saw was dismissed as misunderstanding. What he heard was called imagination. And the message, subtle yet relentless, was that his senses could no longer be trusted. It's a devastating maneuver, because once doubt is redirected inward, the conversation ends before it even begins.
Why she started having so much animosity towards me? Because I ended up finding out the truth, y'all. And I'm not saying this because it's a bad thing, but I'm saying this because, and when I say not a bad thing, because I don't judge people who live that lifestyle, but she has done a lot of bashing towards people who live that lifestyle and talk so bad about them and say so many foul things about them.
That moment changed everything. According to Papoose, the shift wasn't triggered by accusation, it was triggered by awareness. The instant the truth became visible, the emotional dynamic inverted. The person asking questions became the problem. The person noticing patterns became the aggressor. And that inversion is critical, because resentment rarely follows wrongdoing, it follows exposure. From there, everything escalated rapidly. According to Papoose, what he witnessed next left no room for doubt, no space for interpretation. No reading between the lines, just a moment, a scene, a line that could never be uncrossed. He claims he directly encountered his partner and the same individual together inside his own home, in a way that defied explanation. But more disturbing than the act itself, by his account, was the environment in which it happened. His home, his sanctuary, with his child nearby. That single detail transformed allegation into moral rupture. When adult secrecy overlaps with a child's presence, the conversation changes permanently. It stops being about personal boundaries, it becomes about responsibility. According to Papoose, his reaction wasn't violent. It wasn't performative. It was immediate, decisive. He removed the third party from the home, drawing a line he believed should never have been crossed. But what came next pushed everything into irreversibility. Instead of accountability, he was met with denial. Instead of acknowledgement, blame. His experience was reframed as delusion. His certainty dismissed as confusion. And that's when resentment hardened into outright hostility. Because nothing provokes anger faster than a truth that refuses to be unlearned.
Blamed me. Said it wasn't true. Said my ears deceived me. My eyes deceived me. Which goes back to what I was telling y'all earlier. She's the type of person who will say something to you, and 10 to 5 minutes later, she'll say, I didn't say that. Straight bipolar. Straight bipolar. Was diagnosed with it. So ever since I caught that, she resented me. She had a lot of animosity towards me because...
From that point forward, according to Papoose, the relationship ceased functioning as a partnership. Communication was no longer about resolution. It became about control. Silence was no longer neutral. It had become tactical. And when silence turns tactical, exposure becomes inevitable. This is the context in which everything eventually spilled into public view. Instagram lives, receipts, divorce filings, not impulsive reactions, but the final moves after every private channel had collapsed. Papoose's decision to speak publicly didn't happen in a vacuum. In his framing, it came only after every internal option had been exhausted, after denial replaced dialogue, after accountability was swapped for character attacks. Once that line was crossed, the narrative fractured. On one side, allegations of betrayal, secrecy, and manipulation. On the other, counterclaims of control, financial misuse, and emotional neglect. The public wasn't given a tidy truth. It was given two competing realities. And in the middle of this collision, another name entered the conversation, Clarissa Shields. Her involvement didn't just add a complication, it shifted the entire lens. Suddenly, this story wasn't merely about a marriage ending. It was about overlapping timelines, assurances given privately and contradicted publicly, futures promised while pasts remained unresolved. According to public statements, Clarissa believed she was engaging with someone whose marriage was effectively over. Plans were discussed. Emotional investment was real. And when those assumptions collided with ongoing marital conflict, the fallout intensified. Public perception followed almost instantly. Teams formed. Narratives hardened. Allegiances were declared. But beneath all the shouting, the posts, and the viral clips, one fact remained inescapable. A child existed in the midst of it all. Inside that blast radius was a child. That's what lifted this from mere celebrity drama to something far heavier. Because no matter who is believed, defended, or criticized, the emotional cost didn't remain online. It lived in a household, in routines, in the life of someone far too young to consent to public scrutiny. That's why this story resonates, not because of fame, not because of gossip, but because it exposes how easily public image can eclipse private responsibility. According to Papoose, the most painful part wasn't the exposure itself. It was the refusal to acknowledge harm, the insistence on rewriting events instead of repairing the damage, the prioritization of narrative over accountability. And once that line is crossed, reconciliation becomes impossible. This chapter ends not with verdicts, not with proof laid bare for judgment, but with the stark realization that truth doesn't need consensus to exist. Sometimes, it only needs to be recognized. And once it is, silence ceases to be an option. What remains unanswered isn't just what happened, but what happens next. How much of this story remains untold? And will accountability ever arrive without external pressure? Because when private truths are forced into the public sphere, the fallout doesn't fade quietly, it multiplies. This is where the story stops being entertainment and begins to serve as a warning. What collapsed here wasn't just a marriage. It was an image that millions had been taught to believe in, a symbol sold as proof that loyalty conquers all. Now it lies in fragments, accusations, denial, emotional wreckage. And once that illusion shatters, there is no putting it back together without someone being hurt. What makes this tragedy heavier isn't fame. It isn't money. It's the quiet, gut-wrenching truth. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes, it arrives silently, hides behind explanations, and survives precisely because no one wants to confront it. No one wants to confront it directly. By the time the truth forces its way out, the damage has already spread. This is how trust dies, not with noise, but with strategy. Once silence becomes a shield instead of honesty, every relationship transforms into a battlefield of narratives. Who controls the story? Who seems credible? Who appears damaged? Who earns sympathy? Who carries the blame? And while adults battle over perception, the true cost is quietly paid somewhere else, away from cameras, away from headlines, by someone who never asked to be part of the war. That's the part most people skip, because it's easier to argue online than to sit with the wreckage left behind when love turns into resentment and loyalty becomes leverage. It's easier to pick sides than to admit the truth. Sometimes there are no winners, only survivors. So before you decide who to believe, ask yourself why this story feels so uncomfortable. Why it refuses to settle neatly. Why every explanation seems to create more questions than it answers. And why the loudest voices are rarely the most honest. This isn't closure. This is exposure. And the truth has a way of resurfacing, no matter how carefully it is buried.